In this video, we're going to talk about how neurons communicate to other neurons through a process called a synapse. We're going to talk about the type of neurotransmitters that neurons use to communicate, and we're going to talk about the parts of the brain. So in our last video, we talked about how a nerve signal travels down a neuron, it bounds around these myelinated regions, and it gets to the end of the axon. Well, what happens when it reaches the end? Well, something called a synapse happens there. So the chemical signal comes down to the end. It's going to signal to these little vesicles that contain a neurotransmitter to basically move them to the cell membrane, and then they will be secreted through this process of exocytosis, fusing with the membrane. Those neurotransmitters will diffuse across this synaptic cleft and bind to channel proteins on the other side. And if they're excitatory neurotransmitters, it'll signal them to open, and it may cause this next neuron to fire, or if they're inhibitory, it might block them and cause them to stay shut and not allow them to fire. So depending on the neurotransmitter, it'll either signal the next neuron in a neural network to fire or prevent it from firing. Okay, so let's talk about some of the neurotransmitters that are important. First off, when we talked about muscles, we talked about acetylcholine is an important neurotransmitter in motor neurons, and it's released around muscle cells. And when it's released, it causes muscles to contract. So acetylcholine was one that's associated with exciting muscle cells and causing contractions. Okay. We also have another important neurotransmitter called norepinephrine. It's more commonly known as adrenaline. Adrenaline is usually excitatory, right? So when I'm excited or scared, my heart races, I increase my breathing. That's because I'm producing adrenaline, but it's also inhibitory. It inhibits my digestive tract, right? So if I'm really nervous or stressed and I'm under a lot of adrenaline, I don't feel hungry. I'm not going to be digesting food. Sometimes people are so stressed out they vomit because their digestive tract says, get rid of this, we can't function. So it's actually excitatory and inhibitory. Dopamine is an important neurotransmitter associated with our reward pathways. So when you're hungry and you give your body food, you feel so good, it tastes so good, you're actually releasing dopamine from that. Dopamine is also one that many drugs stimulate the release of. So a lot of drugs actually work on neural networks that cause releases of dopamine. Crystal methamphetamine, cocaine, these both cause huge releases of dopamine. Another one, serotonin, is also associated with reward and feeling of kind of euphoria and really good feelings. And this is one that when you take ecstasy causes high releases of serotonin. Unfortunately, when you take these drugs, your body starts to get used to feeling these high levels of dopamine and serotonin. And then when you stop taking them, you feel irritable, agitated, and can't function. And that's when you can become chemically addicted. So just like anything, if you use them and continue to use them, your body develops a tolerance, and then you become chemically addicted. One less important neurotransmitter down here is an endorphin, and you've probably heard of endorphins. They're our body's natural painkillers. They tend to be inhibitory, and they tend to work on these neural networks associated with pain. So when you're running a race, at the end of the race you get that runner's high. That's your body releasing these endorphins to basically suppress any of that pain that you would feel from that really hard run. Or when a woman is in labor, her body will actually release natural endorphins because that birthing process is very painful. It's the body's natural way to deal with pain. And of course, we've developed morphine and other painkillers to mimic endorphins and block pain in the body. So these are some important neurotransmitters that either excite or inhibit neurons in our neural pathways of our nervous system. So let's talk about the parts of the brain. First off, we've got the lower brain, what we call the brain stem. They're calling it the hindbrain here, but I like to just call it the brain stem because it's kind of the stem of the brain. The cerebellum is important. It's associated with balance and coordination. So if you ski, skateboard, do anything that requires balance, you're definitely using your cerebellum. Your pons and your medulla oblongata are associated with breathing and heart rate. Again, these are all involuntary processes. You don't have to tell your heart to increase or tell your lungs to breathe more heavily. That happens automatically when they sense low oxygen levels in the body, right? Then moving up to the midbrain, there's an important part of the midbrain called the thalamus, which connects our lower brain to our upper brain. And then just below the thalamus is an important structure called the hypothalamus. Hypo means below, so this is below the thalamus, and this is the part of the brain that connects to our endocrine system. Our endocrine system is governed by an important gland called the pituitary gland. This is the master gland that controls a lot of the other hormones that are released in the body. So it is controlled by the hypothalamus, which sits on top of it, and we're going to talk, when we get to the endocrine system, we'll talk about the role of the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. And then up on top, this is the part of our brain that really makes us unique from all the other animals. This is the cerebral cortex, okay? Sometimes also called the cerebrum. And if we look at that, we can see that that's broken down into these sort of main quadrants or lobes. We've got the frontal lobe, frontal association area. This is involved with problem solving and sort of judgment and kind of critical thinking skills that we're trying to always develop in you guys. Back here in the parietal lobe, we have motor skills and also senses and touching, as well as reading, and then sensory association. Something feels slimy, oh, I don't like that. Something feels silky and smooth, ooh, I like that, right? Associating sort of feelings with things that I touch. In the back, we have the occipital lobes. These are involved in visual stimulation and visual processing. If you get banged in the back of the head, sometimes you'll see a flash or you'll see stars. That's because you've overstimulated these neurons and they're firing. So anything visual is back there. And then on the sides, this is sort of in your temples or temporal lobes, sort of over here. We have smell, hearing, and then auditory association. I'm listening to music. Ooh, I like that music. Ooh, it's relaxing me. Or someone's taking their fingernails and running them down a chalkboard. Ooh, I don't like that sound, right? I'm associating positive and negative feelings with it. Okay, so those are all parts of the brain. Interestingly, our motor cortex and our sensory motor cortex are laid out kind of like your body parts have been put on there. And if you stimulate one part, it'll be your face. Right next to that will be your hand, your arm, your abdomen, your knee, and so forth. They actually learned this by basically stimulating different parts of the brain, and it's kind of like they've taken a body and laid it out there, and all these parts are laid one next to another. It's just kind of an interesting thing about how our brain is kind of laid out like a circuit box for your house, and when you're trying to figure out which circuit is connected to which, they're all kind of laid out like that. It's just kind of an interesting thing about our brain. Last thing I'm going to talk about is the emotional and sensory processing. This is called the limbic system. So when we touch, taste, smell things, we associate them with emotions, memories. We store our short-term memories in the hippocampus and the amygdala. And the amygdala is what gives us kind of emotional context to things. So if you smell something really bad or vile, that will give you an emotional response, you know. Or if you smell something very pleasant or something that reminds you, a perfume that your old girlfriend used to wear, it might kind of spark some emotions in your body. Or you hear music that reminds you of something, a certain summer when a song was popular, it may bring an emotional response. So all these different senses are tied together through the hippocampus and the amygdala and give us sort of emotional context to many of these sights, sounds, touches, and tastes that we have. And it's just kind of an interesting thing about our brain that we actually associate emotions and memories. And sometimes if you have an emotional relationship to something, you remember it a lot more strongly. You probably remember where you were. Well, you don't remember 9/11, you're probably too young, but people always remember where they were, what they were doing at a certain time because of the emotional context, because of the sort of circuits, the neurons that they've connected through the amygdala and the hippocampus and when they process those memories. So this is just a quick overview of the brain and how our neurons are connected in the brain. Okay.